Good morning, rise and shine. My name is Sei Kim. I am the Deputy Chief Program Officer at AAAS, and on behalf of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I want to add to the welcome for this 10th Annual Emerging Researchers National ERN Conference. You know, this is my only second conference, and I'm totally hooked. It's just a wonderful, inspiring place to be and to see all of you. I hope you have a wonderful time. Dr. Maureen Kearney, who is the Chief Program Officer, will be here later to greet many of you. Again, I'm the deputy, and we work within the Office of Science, Policy, and Society programs at AAAS. The unit supports and manages a number of different programs in and around science, such as placing scientists in government, to advise on policy, enriching science education, supporting diversity and inclusion in the STEM pipeline, such as the ERN conference, facilitating conversations in religious communities, contributing to issues in scientific responsibility and human rights, and building research capacity and peer review processes globally. I tell you these programs to show you how many areas of society that science touches, and that you, as future scientists, can contribute to making the world a better place. I want to take a little bit of time to thank the National Science Foundation for their continuing commitment to develop the next generation of STEM talent. And I want to take some time to thank the staff who are very dedicated. You know, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to put a conference like this together, from finding scientific content, finding amazing speakers, to making sure that registration goes smoothly and that food is great, right? So I want to call out the names, and at the end, I would like to ask you guys to join me in giving them a round of applause. So here goes: Dr. Shirley Malcolm, Dr. Yolanda George, Dr. Iris Wagstaff, Ms. Neela White, Dr. Jennifer Carinci, Ms. Donna Beher, Ms. Betty Callinger, Mr. Tara Clayton, Mr. Marty Clark, Ms. Allison Gonzalez, Ms. Lorraine Summers, and Ms. Janaea Thompson. Please thank them. As you go through today, if you see them around, please take the time to thank them and just tell them, especially if you're having a wonderful time, it does encourage them. So I want to take a brief moment to share with you a little bit about science. I'm a geneticist and neuroscientist by training, and I found that there are lessons from science to thrive in science or in life in general. So this is going to be an interactive exercise, okay? So first lesson is that science is hard. It's really hard. You know this already, right? For some of you who have been doing research. And on top of that, life sometimes gets really hard. And when you're going through school and life and you start to hear voices of doubt and someone discourages you or life knocks you down, and you start thinking, maybe I don't have what it takes, I want you to do one thing: denounce those thoughts. Science can be hard, but as you know, experiments also teaches us to try again. The next experiment just needs to work, and it will. So replace those negative voices with voices of affirmation. You are smart, you are valued, you are talented, and you're resilient. Science can be hard, but you are stronger. Have grit, be courageous. So, I told you this is gonna be interactive. We're gonna do a little exercise. The students, I want you to stand up, stand tall, stand up, stand up, stand tall, stand tall. Turn to somebody next to you and say this, but you're going to fill in the blanks for me. You're going to say, I am an aspiring blank, scientist, engineer, entrepreneur, take your pick, and say, I'm an aspiring blank, and I will succeed because I am blank. And I need, the second blank is something positive. I am strong, I'm resilient, I'm smart, all right? So, ready? Ready, go. I am a scientist, and I will succeed because I am smart. All right. Did you guys really mean it? You guys meant it? Okay. All right. You sit back down now. All right. And I want you guys to repeat that whenever you have voices of doubt, okay? Second thing, research can sometimes be lonely, but science teaches us that great discoveries and inventions and accomplishments are not done alone. Look around you. Those are your peers. Someone with whom you will cure diseases, turn around climate change, will invent the next technology. You need them, and they need you. A great leader is one that helps others to become great leaders. So science can sometimes be lonely, but you are not alone. So again, turn to your peers and say, I value you and want to help you succeed. So, good job. Lastly, we heard this yesterday. Success in science lies on the shoulders of great giants. And I want to particularly highlight the teachers and mentors, some of them who are here. Find them and thank them. You are here because of them, and they will continue to support you. In engaging with your mentors, don't be afraid to ask. If you have questions, someone else is probably wondering the same thing. Science is about asking the right questions. Be a leader and ask things that no one else would. Ask for help. Tell your mentors what you need. They are here to help you succeed. So remember, you guys are amazing, and you're surrounded by people who want to make sure that you succeed. As I look out to you, know that you are our inspiration and our hope. Welcome and enjoy the conference. We have a wonderful panel led by Dr. Camille McHale. She is a provost and vice president for the academic affairs at the University of Virgin Islands. Dr. McHale is also a PI for the NSF-funded Center for Advancement of STEM Leadership. And you can read her bio in the program. She's amazing. But she was also, I just want to highlight that she was also the program officer at NSF to support HBCU undergraduate program at the Director of Education and Human Resources. And she is a mathematician, gotten her PhD at Bates College. Please welcome Dr. McHale.
Good morning, everyone. Let me welcome you to day 2 of the 10th annual Emerging Researchers National Conference. I was looking through the pictures, and I have to check my calendar because I think I've been at all 10. So anyone else been at all 10? Woo, yes, it's great. For those of you for whom this is your first, you're in for a treat. And you're in for a treat with this morning's session. So last night, for those of you who were here, you heard from some ERN alum, and one of the threads that came through was their draw to give back, their draw to make a difference. And this, I find, is not an uncommon trait among our students, among many of you sitting here, who have a strong sense of community. And so if that is you, then this panel is for you. You will meet 3 persons who are using STEM to give back, or some might say to pay it forward. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and then we will have some time at the end for questions, and I'm sure you will have many. So make sure if you have a pencil or something, jot some notes down so that it can be succinct, because they're going to come at you with a lot of information. So our first panelist, Davina Durgana. Dr. Durgana is an award-winning international human rights statistician who has developed leading global models to assess risk and vulnerability to modern slavery. She's a report co-author and senior statistician on the Global Slavery Index of the Minderoo Foundation's Walk Free Initiative. She's American Statistical Association's 2016 Statistical Advocate of the Year, committee members of Statistics Without Borders, and Forbes Top 30 Under 30 in science for 2017 for her work in statistical modeling, human security theory, and human trafficking. Dr. Durgana is an assistant professor of sustainable development at SIT Graduate Institute here in DC, where she's serving as lead faculty in the Inclusive and Human Security Graduate Certificate Program. Her many accolades are outlined on page 21 of your program book. But among them, some I'd just like to highlight. She was selected as Google Fellow for Technology and Social Change. She was awarded the Trafficking in America Task Force Award and was named Disruption Awards Foundation Fellow for 2018. She started early in receiving the University Award for Outstanding Scholarship at the graduate level from American University, where she received her PhD in International Relations with distinction. Her master's degree is she received in Paris, France, while studying human trafficking at the Sorbonne and the American University of Paris. And her bachelor's degree is from George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Our second panelist, Dr. Shakobi Wilson, is an associate professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has over 15 years of experience as an environmental health scientist in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community-engaged research, including crowd science and community-based participatory research, air pollution studies, built environment, industrial animal production, climate change, and community resiliency. Wow. He works primarily in partnership with community-based organizations and is the director of the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Initiative, which is an initiative focused on providing technical assistance to communities fighting against environmental injustice and environmental health disparities. Among other distinctions, he is a member of the US EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. He's on the board of Citizen Science Association, and he is a former chair of Alpha Goes Green initiative of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. He is a two-time EPA Star Fellow, Udall Scholar, NASA Space Scholar, and a Thurgood Marshall Scholar who received his BS degree in biology and ecotoxicology with a minor in environmental science from Alabama A&M University. Any in the house? Thank you. He received both his MS and PhD in environmental health from UNC Chapel Hill. And the third panelist, Dr. Diana Youssef, is a serial entrepreneur. And usually you don't hear that with the whole social science, right? So listen up. Serial entrepreneur with 10 years experience commercializing technology for social and environmental impact in the developing world. Formerly, she's consulted for McKinsey, co-founded the IFC, World Bank's Life Sciences Investment Group, and the United Nations Inclusive Markets Incubator, and was a seed stage venture capitalist with Battelle Ventures. She co-founded We Cyclers, which is a social venture to clean up urban slums and create recyclables, supply chain linkages in Nigeria. Immerse Global, which is a Stanford spin-out to develop atmospheric water capture technologies, and Sac-Size Solar, MIT spin-out to develop revolutionary new materials to lower the cost of solar energy. She's a former protein biochemist with her bachelor's from Harvard, her PhD from Cornell, and holds an MBA and an MA in international development from Columbia. She serves as an advisor to TED Fellows Program and a founding council member for NASA's and USAID's Launch Accelerator, and she's also founder and CEO of Change Water Labs. Did I tell you? Did I tell you? Did I tell you? It is going to be an amazing morning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists.
Okay, great. This will be it, right? Hello, everyone. Good morning. It is such an honor to be here with you today. I was able to meet some of you over at the breakfast line, and I'm really excited that you're all here to share some of our work with us. We look forward to seeing you as the future that carries on a lot of the work that we've begun. So, my name's Davina Dragana, and I'm a statistician who works on fighting modern slavery. It might not be clear how someone can do that. I work with an organization called the Minderoo Foundation. We're one of Asia's largest philanthropic organizations. And what's really cool at Minderoo is that we don't just work on modern slavery. As a statistician, I get to work across several different initiatives, including our Flourishing Oceans Initiative, where we're developing a global fishing index that's looking at human rights abuses in our seafood supply chains. I also don't have it up here, but we just announced via the recent bushfires in Australia, where our organization is headquartered, that we'll be starting a fire fund dedicating $70 million towards fighting the bushfires, but also $54 million of that is earmarked for prevention. So as a former volunteer firefighter and EMT, for me it's really exciting to have an opportunity to find ways to make a lot of our countries more sustainable and to think of ways that we can prevent this in the future. But all of this to say that you might not think statistics would play a big role in all of it, but it does. You can work for an organization where your skills can transfer across a lot of different domain areas. So one of the big projects I work on is estimating how many slaves there are in the world, and there are a few reasons why you would want to know that. If you don't know how many slaves there are or how many people that you're trying to help, it's really hard to dedicate good policy to helping those in need. What I do is I oversee a large survey research program where we basically do national surveys in loads of countries to try to estimate where modern slavery is occurring. Getting to that point is pretty difficult, but we were able to do it. We just created one joint number with the International Labor Organization. That's an organization out of the United Nations. And we agreed that 40.3 million people were in a form of slavery on any given day in 2016. To break that down for you, that's 24.9 million people in an industry of forced labor, and you might be more familiar with that. That's agriculture, construction, fishing, sex work. But 15.4 million people are actually in forced marriage. And this was actually a really political thing to consider forced marriage alongside more traditional forms of slavery. But as statisticians, we were able to find enough evidence of this to make a compelling argument that it had to be included and brought to the policy table. Forced marriage is not the same as arranged marriage. When I do surveys in Russia or in places that just don't have a legacy of arranged marriages, it's very clear what the difference is. Were you forced to enter this marriage, or were you able to leave of your own accord or make your own decisions? However, when we do this in countries like Ethiopia or Pakistan or India, where there are legacies of arranged marriages and cultural bride payments, such as dowries, it gets very complicated. At what point does this not a financial crime when someone's forced or compelled by their family to do this? For all of our measurements, we only include the most extreme cases, so you can be pretty confident that this is actually an underestimate. These are the major industries I mentioned for the 24.9 million, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these. But basically, my job is finding the hidden and uncontrolled spaces. Surveys, traditional surveys, typically look at households. That's not too difficult to figure out, and we ask about really tough questions. So it's always hard to find people that are very hidden, but the real challenge in our work is finding people that are outside of the scope of those normal households. How do I find forced conscriptants in Burundi and Eritrea? How do I understand what is going on in the deep sea fishing industry? We're actually using satellite imagery to understand transshipment networks, to understand where people might be kept at sea for up to 7 years at a time, unable to come back to shore or return to their families. We also look at irregular migration and refugees. I oversee all of our research in the Americas, and a lot of the problems that we're seeing following Venezuela are showing us that a lot of people are very vulnerable to migration patterns, specifically when we're unable to create safe pathways for them. Personally, as a statistician, I find it very motivating that there's the potential that we can avoid issues like this in the future. My job isn't just to tell you what's going on right now. My goal is to try to predict what might cause this to happen again in the future so we can work together and collaborate to find ways to protect people. For me, Venezuela was a very big disappointment because we knew a lot of the patterns of what happens when governments are compromised after Syria, And we knew, we saw very many of the same socioeconomic issues arising in Venezuela. So for me, to not have ways to protect these people, even knowing what we did, it's something that I take very personally, and I'm working very hard to try to come up with models that'll help us understand these patterns in the future. Oh, sorry. One thing to add, too, is that a lot of times people think that our work is global, that this doesn't happen in the United States. And in fact, some of my colleagues in the past have said that there are actually all forms of modern slavery in the United States except for child soldiers. However, I spent some time with my little sister in the south side of Chicago while she was working with AmeriCorps, and everything I saw and learned about gang recruitment and children in those communities indicated to me that there were very little substantive differences between child recruitment into child gangs in the south side of Chicago and what I was seeing in Colombia. A lot of it has to do with viable law enforcement, whether or not there's adequate protection, and what individuals have to do to keep their families safe. So this is in our backyards, too. The Global Slavery Index looks at measurement. We measure prevalence through our surveys. We look at government response. So we actually have a database online that has a detailed breakdown of all of the things governments do to try to help fight this crime. And we look at vulnerability. I develop risk models that try to assess what might or might not predict modern slavery. The two that are most relevant to the statistics of today are really prevalence and vulnerability. This is kind of a map of the world. In 2016, we used 48 countries as a random sample of what might happen, and that was mostly because that's where we could do some of these surveys. We shared data sources with other UN agencies, and we're basically able to create one of the world's biggest databases and data sets on modern slavery. I also want to say that statistics is not just about numbers, right? There's context here. These are people's voices, people's experiences. And so I always share what we call verbatims, or free response opportunities to our surveys here. As you can see, there's a wide variety of ways that people can experience modern slavery, but I think this is really powerful. When we talk about a 27-year-old male in Tunis, and he's saying that they withheld his papers and his passport, they forced him to sell drugs to repay debts of a family member who was in prison at the time. That's a pretty extreme version, but actually the #1 reason why most people in 2016 stayed in a situation of modern slavery wasn't because their passports were withheld or because they were physically detained. It was actually because wages were withheld. So these were people who were staying in situations of forced labor in the hopes of accruing or recouping money that they were owed. And they stayed in these situations for an average of 5 to 7 years. So can you imagine the policy changes that need to happen in order to inform workers of what they're actually facing in terms of risks? When I measure vulnerability, I look at multiple risk factors at a global level. However, that's really only at one piece of the pie. I'm currently developing regional risk models that'll help give us a little bit more specificity and help inform some interventions at a more local level. Prevalence also builds on these survey data points, and basically what we do is we come up with this global estimate and then use my risk model to determine how many slaves must be in each country. And then government response is a critical component of this because it assesses the government's willingness and ability to fight this crime. So effectively, it's not just research, though. All of the information that we develop on the Global Slavery Index actually feeds into a few other initiatives. We have the Global Freedom Network, which brings together faith communities, which may not sound like an important part of this effort, but actually in many countries where the governments cannot afford to provide critical services to many of the people that need it, faith-based communities are often the only alternatives we have to try to provide those services. We also have the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, and what that does is looks at supply chain responsibility for major government players and businesses. So basically, we are saying that if your company is headquartered in California, let's say, and you're developing smartphones or computers, but you're making those materials on the basis of cobalt that's coming from the DRC, where young children are working in unregulated and often collapsing mines near enriched uranium fields, then perhaps you bear some of the responsibility in what's happening here. We have a Freedom Fund, which is basically an incubator that looks at trialing interventions at a much smaller level to see what works before we scale it to millions of dollars worth of work. And we have Freedom United, which works at getting this message out to everyone that might need it. Finally, I love ending on this slide. I work on a committee with Customs and Border Patrol on withhold release orders. Those are basically orders that allow us to prevent the importation into US ports of goods that are known to be made with forced labor or child labor. Sounds like a good idea, right? Unfortunately, we still import loads and loads of these goods into the United States. And what's interesting is when we did an analysis of this, most of the money that comes into G20 countries from at-risk industries that we know are produced with child and forced labors, electronics, garments, typically from Bangladesh, Vietnam, fishing, like the deep-sea fishing I mentioned in Southeast Asia, cocoa, typically from West Africa, and timber, actually from the Amazon, the heart of the South America. That's all coming into the United States, and actually we share by far the largest margin of that importation. So basically, one thing to end on is that as consumers, you guys can help us make better decisions about where these goods are coming. By decreasing demand and asking questions of your favorite producers, we can actually find ways to eliminate the amount of forced labor that goes into our supply chains and is benefiting from the money in our pockets. You guys have the power to change this, and all it takes is a little statistics. Thanks, everyone.
So again, I'm Jacoby Wilson. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm an environmental health scientist, and so I primarily focus on issues of environmental justice. You may ask, what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is a social movement that looks at the issues of how some communities, due to their race, ethnicity, class, geography, are overburdened by environmental hazards. What you see in the background is a part of a video called Right to Harm. Right to Harm is a documentary about how some communities across the country are differentially impacted by what we call concentrated animal feeding operations. For those of you in eastern North Carolina, those are hog farms. Those of you who are in Iowa, those are hog farms and chicken farms. For those of you on the eastern shore of Maryland, those are also chicken farms. For those of you who come from New Mexico or California, that may be cattle feedlots. And so what happens is you have a large number of animals being raised in a small amount of space. Think about the amount of waste that's produced. And so that waste can impact water quality, that waste can impact air quality. So people have waste that's been literally sprayed on their homes. They have waste that's been sprayed in their gardens. They cannot go outside to enjoy their property. So this is the issue of environmental injustice. Because of the disproportionate burden of these animal operations of people of color, that's an example we call environmental racism. How many of you heard the term environmental racism before? Raise your hands. So we need you getting degrees in STEM to help do studies to address environmental racism. And so when you think about this environmental justice movement, in many ways it started with Dr. King and his work with the sanitation workers in Memphis when he was assassinated, looking at issues around labor, issues of environment, and issues of health. So for those of you who may not remember that fight, there were black men carrying around signs that they were saying, "I am a man." Because of the issues that they were dealing with, they were treated less than human. So by carrying around signs saying, "I am a man," they were trying to tell people, "I am a man, I am human, value my humanity." That's what you don't see in communities impacted by environmental injustice. Those communities have been commodified and decommodified. Some communities are valued more than other communities. So for those of you who may come from a community, you may have a grandmother, grandfather, family members who live close to a landfill, who live close to an incinerator, who live close to coal-fired power plants. These are issues of environmental injustice. And so my work as an environmental health scientist, I try to use science to study those issues and then try to work with communities to translate that data to action. To me, it's important to do science that's just not for the sake of science. Science with a purpose, science for social change, science that focuses on action. So I'm going to get into show you a few of my projects that we currently work on. So we're doing projects across the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, Deep South and Gulf Coast. I'll jump to the Gulf Coast first. So there's a consortium of historically black colleges and universities that work on issues of climate change and disasters in the Gulf Coast. This consortium is directed by Dr. Robert Bullard, who's at Texas Southern, and Dr. Beverly Wright with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. They're working in communities in Houston, Texas, primarily the Pasadena neighborhood. For those of you who know about Houston, Houston has a lot of petrochemical facilities. They have the Houston Ship Channel. So there are a lot of pollution sources. You may have seen in the news over the past 6 months, there have been fires, there have been factory events, explosions, people have lost their lives. So they're doing work in that community to use science to try to understand what are some of the problems around air quality, and then again, come up with solutions. We also, through this consortium, are engaging folks in Africatown, Mobile, Alabama. Some of you may know about Africatown. That's the community where they found the last slave ship, the Clotilda. That community also has a lot of issues with industrial hazards. Also, we're working in Biloxi, Mississippi, and also Pensacola, Florida. So with this consortium, you see issues around hazards, vulnerability, disaster risk, and communities that are impacted by health disparities. So again, for those of you in the room, think about the fields, the STEM fields that could be brought to bear to do studies in those communities. You have chemistry, you have physics, you have urban planning, you have sociology, you have environmental science, you also have informatics. There's a great need for informatics, there's a great need for technology in these communities so we can have technological and engineering solutions to address those environmental health problems. Additionally, I work in other parts of the country, and it's gonna click real quick. So some of the work that I've done in my previous current work includes working with a community known as the Low Country Alliance of Model Communities. So in Charleston, South Carolina, many of you maybe know about Charleston or live in the area, have family there. We are working with a community to understand the impacts of goods movement. So you may ask, what is goods movement? Basically, when we have goods that come in from ships, through ports, you have intermodal vehicles that move those goods off those ships and then move those goods into rail and the diesel trucks, and those goods are then moved to warehouses. Why that's a problem, there's a lot of pollutants associated with goods movement. So when you have burning of diesel exhaust, we have pollutants such as particulate matter, volatile organic compounds. We also have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that can impact human health. So what we've been doing through a community-university partnership is training the residents to be community scientists, to collect their own data and use that data for action. One important outcome of this collaboration, we were able to shut down the county incinerator because the county incinerator was in this black community, okay? We've been able to translate the data into zoning changes. We've been able to use that data to get more green space access for the community. We've also been able to use that data to help with mitigation of the impacts of the Port of Charleston. So again, this is where we can use science for action. What an important parts of this collaboration, we've been trying to build hyper-local air quality monitoring networks in this community, in other communities. And what do I mean by that? In many communities that host multiple environmental hazards, particularly incinerators, refineries, petrochemical facilities, landfills, industrial animal operations, they may not have the appropriate monitoring footprint to surveil or track the types of pollutants that have been released, the amounts, the concentrations, and really to connect those exposures to health outcomes. And so what we've been doing is using technology again to try to build out these hyper-local air quality monitor networks that will allow us to capture the spatial temporal patterning of pollution. And then again, the community can use that data for action. So we're doing this in Charleston, primarily in North Charleston. We're also doing this in Savannah, Georgia. We have built a network out in Uniontown, Alabama, which I'll get to. We're also doing this work of building out these networks in the Washington, D.C. area. So this is really a core part of my work of using big data, informatics, and technology to, again, capture exposures and then be able to use that data for policy change and other action. So let me highlight Uniontown real quick. Uniontown is a community in Alabama. It's near Selma. Uniontown is a community that has a landfill that takes in trash from 36 states in the country. They also take in fly ash. They have 4 million tons of fly ash in this landfill. The landfill was built on top of an old plantation cemetery. So we don't respect your living, and we don't respect the people who are dead, okay? They also have a catfish plant and feed mill. They have a cheese plant, and they also For many of you, when we flush our toilets, our waste goes to a treatment system. When they flush their toilets, their waste goes to a containment pond, and then the human waste is sprayed on the ground. So we're talking about STEM, folks. There's no STEM involved in that process. So we've been working in this community since 2018 to, again, help them build their capacity to use science and technology to collect data for action. We've also worked in other communities like Mebane, North Carolina. In Mebane, there's post-slavery black communities that didn't have access to sewer and water infrastructure. And so what we're able to do is to do surveys, do water quality analysis to help them get data. That project led to these communities getting first-time installation to sewer and water infrastructure. So in the U.S., we have communities that do not have adequate access to water and adequate access to sewer. In all these communities that I've talked about, from the Gulf Coast to Uniontown to Mebane, the folks in South Carolina, these issues of environmental injustice will be exacerbated by climate change, okay? So again, I can talk longer, but I just want to end. Science is important, but science is not the end. Science is a means to an end. We have to be training students who use science for action, science for problem solving, and science for social justice. Thank you.
All right, can you guys see me over the podium? I'm petite, not small. So my name's Diana Youssef, and I think I'm going to use my time to talk about the journey that I took from being a failed scientist to being a social entrepreneur. I don't know, probably I'm assuming that, does this work? Oh, great, super. So I'm assuming that a lot of you got into science because you were fascinated by nature. I was a little kid who was just obsessed with, how did the world work and how did the molecules that put the world together create form and function? So by the time I landed as an undergrad at Harvard, it wasn't even a question. I was going to study science. So I studied biochemistry and went through my undergrad and proceeded to a PhD program also, just not even questioning my career path, and chose to become a protein biochemist studying structural biology. And I spent 6 years of my life on that guy. This is a protein that represents a family that has the great name of P24s. And they're thought to be involved with essentially a manufacturing and postal delivery system inside of the cell that helps get proteins that get made inside the cell off to the places where they act. So they were considered very important across all eukaryotic cells. And so I spent 6 years trying to figure out what these looked like and what they did. The first 3 years of my PhD, I spent essentially shooting electromagnetic waves at tubes of this protein and coming up with these patterns of spots that then I would sit in front of a big computer screen in a dark, cold room off in like the basement of the lab and figure out, what spot was what atom and what atom was next to what other atom so that I could fold up an amino acid chain into a beta barrel structure to create this form of this protein. And then once we figured out what it looked like, then I spent the next 3 years of my life trying to figure out what it did. So then I spent 3 years at the lab bench doing experiments trying to figure out what this protein talked to and what kind of functions it had in the cell. The whole time, the whole 6 years I was in the lab, the running soundtrack of my PhD was the BBC News. And I basically had that running in the background. And I was listening to international news, and I was specifically interested in what was happening in developing countries. And that should have been my first hint that I was not going to be a good academic, because I really cared too much about what was happening in the outside world. And so the other thing that kind of clued me in that I wasn't going to be an academic was that this ended up being a failed project. We could not figure out what these things did, and I got no publications out of my PhD. So with the door of academia shut, I had to kind of figure out what was my path. So I decided, kind of randomly, why don't I apply to business school? Not because I really thought I was going to get into business school, but because I figured this was an exercise to put my resume together and talk to people and figure out what kind of career paths were out there. So I wrote these whack essays about how I wanted to take science skills and put them together with a set of business skills and go solve problems for people in Africa. They must have thought I was nuts, and they must have wanted to meet me because they let me into business school, which was crazy. And so I stumbled into business school. And while I was there, I decided, why don't I lengthen my education and add another master's degree and do an international affairs degree focused on international development, economic and social development, specifically with a regional focus in Africa. So after all this school, it still wasn't obvious to me what my job should be. So then I ended up on this meandering path to try to figure out how to bring all my interests together, the science and technology with my concern about people living in developing countries, and how do I do that with a business skill set? So, of course, what did I do? I became a consultant. I spent a couple years consulting to McKinsey, but the whole time I was still wondering, how can I have an impact on people in the developing world? And so at some point, I cut out from McKinsey for a couple of months to go work at the World Bank, and I started a group that was investing in life science technology sectors in developing countries to help those countries build up their own life science, biotech, and agri-tech sectors. Then I went back to McKinsey, and then it didn't take long before I finally was I was done with it and got recruited to the United Nations Development Program, where I helped with a small group that was starting a new initiative to find ways that business could help alleviate poverty by finding or developing goods and services that can alleviate the problems of the poor, but for a profit. So this was all very cool until the bureaucracy of the UN caught up with us and squashed us and made us kind of sit around and wait for the bureaucracy to figure out where we actually fit. So I kind of was done with being in a big, bulky organization that, couldn't innovate, and ended up going into venture capital, which is kind of, in some ways the opposite of a big bureaucracy, where we were essentially trying to make innovation happen by, at the source. So we were finding technologies in the labs and spinning them out and creating companies around them and trying to figure out how they become products. And I was focused specifically on biotech and clean tech. But while I loved working with the innovators, I'm going to say it in the room of 3,000 people, I hated working with the investor types. They just did not have the same soul that I had. At least that wasn't obvious to me. So I just was I can't. So then I had a kid, and I became completely irrelevant as far as my career was concerned. I fell off the career cliff and had to kind of figure out what I was going to do. So, and I guess what I decided was at this point, I just need to figure out career with meaning. What's going to be the thing that justifies me not being with my kid all the time and doing something that's going to make the world better for her? And I kept sort of circling around the sustainability development goals, and specifically I kept coming back to water. And that might be because my parents are from the Middle East and water's huge. But also water is the thing that kind of has the underpinnings or the link-ins to so many other issues that people face around the world. Social issues around health and gender empowerment and prosperity, also issues around climate change and resource access, but also geopolitical security. And so I had the chance to help advise NASA on looking at water technologies for the space station. And one of the things they were looking at was looking at evaporative technologies as a way to passively soak up clean water out of dirty water and use it for productive purposes, specifically to grow crops on the space station. And I kept thinking, this is kind of cool, this passive water treatment. Could we use this in developing countries? And can we help people in places like Zaatari refugee camp? And so the reason that I bring up Zaatari is because, again, I'm from the Middle East, and there's this huge humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. And, for me to find meaning, one of the things I wanted to be doing is trying to figure out how do I actually help with this huge crisis. And as I was learning about what was happening in Zaatari, I also learned about what the sanitation situation was there. And this is basically what these people were having to deal with. Instead of going to the public toilets that were set up, which were oftentimes kilometers away from where their caravans were, and all the dangers and indignities of doing that, they would just dig holes in the ground and use them as pit latrines. And not only does this turn the camp into a sewage pit, it also endangers the water systems underneath the camps that feed all the Jordanian communities around this camp. The other thing that clinched sanitation as an issue for me was that besides the fact that half of all people in the world don't have access to a clean toilet, and that's because they live in places where they can't flush. And when you can't flush away your waste, things get messy fast. The other thing that was kind of, and this is just kind of what it looks like if you've never been to a country that lacks sanitation. This is what people do to hack sanitation. So the other thing that clinched it for me was that this is a problem that revisits itself way worse to girls than anybody else. And I have 3 girls, and I care about gender empowerment. And when a girl doesn't have access to a safe, clean toilet in her home, not only does she risk disease, she also risks on a daily basis sexual assault. And on top of that, the lack of access of toilets in almost half the schools around the world means that a girl has a really hard time getting through a day of her education. And by the time she hits puberty, about 20% of girls around the world drop out of their education because they can't manage to get through their education without a toilet. So I'm sorry, I'm going to run over time. Is that okay? So anyway, so finally, when I finally decided I need to start, an initiative around this, I came with the idea that, we need to solve sanitation. And in order to do that in places where people can't flush, we need to come up with a new way to flush. And so I founded Change Water Labs, and we are reimagining flushing. So instead of flushing waste, we shrink it, because all of waste that comes out of you is 95% water. So we've created 2 waste-busting technologies. The first one we lovingly call shrink wrap for crap. It's an evaporative membrane that soaks up and evaporates the liquid content of waste. And this demo shows up how our membrane will soak up the water from liquid and solid waste and evaporate it as clean water. And in that way, you can get rid of 95% of daily waste on site. The other waste-busting technology we came up with was a P-powered battery that turns urine into electricity. And here you see this demo where we use P essentially to power a fan. Sorry, it's a little bit slow. So putting these 2 technologies together, we created the iThrone, a waste-shrinking, space-saving, portable drop-in toilet for communities with no power or plumbing. And so what the iThrone does is it collects solid and liquid waste in bags of our evaporative membrane, which then soak up and evaporate daily waste fast. And it uses the P-powered battery to power ventilation systems inside the toilet in order to speed up the evaporation, but also to get rid of odors and cut off gases that get generated when wet waste just sits there. And that also has an impact on methane that gets released from raw sewage. And so what we'd like to do with the iThrone is to essentially address the problem of poor sanitation in crowded communities like urban slums, refugee camps, and also drop-in sanitation in emergency situations. And by cutting down, by shrinking waste on site, the iThrone has the potential to get more safer sanitation for more people. It basically cuts the collection costs in half by shrinking waste on site while increasing sanitation or toilet access and servicing efficiency. So the funding to fund 1 communal toilet could now fund 4 iThrone toilets. And instead of servicers having to spend a lot of time and cost to service a small number of container toilets daily, they could service 20 times more of our iThrones monthly. So what's the impact of a toilet in a home? A family with a toilet in their home has their child being less exposed to diarrheal disease, their daughter less exposed to being raped, and their communities is less exposed to vector-borne disease. And also, not only does the iThrone not use or pollute water, it actually turns waste back into clean water. And it cuts down on carbon emissions related to waste and waste management by reducing collection frequencies, cutting off methane emissions from wet sewage, and also by converting waste back into electricity that could be used for other things. So here's the team behind the magic. Actually, Huda El Assad was the one that was supposed to give this talk, but I stepped in for her because we're actually in the middle of planning for a deployment. And you know, this is something that if anyone's interested in doing a startup, you can't do it in a vacuum. I spent 2 years talking about this idea and, you know, having nobody to work with on this, and nothing was happening. The day that I met Huda was a game changer. Everything happened, like, when I met her. And we started getting resources, we started attracting team members, we started being a real company with real momentum. So I just want to end by saying that, you know, my path was a meandering path. I was a terrible academic scientist. And I mean, I just didn't have the maturity or the purview for it. And instead, I kind of ended up on this meandering path where this is where I've landed. So if that gives any of you an idea of, you know, where you might end up, I hope this was a useful talk. Thank you.
Okay, so there are mics set up all over. I think there are 4, 2 in front, 2 in backs. If you have a question, could you make your way to the microphone? I see at least one person coming. And introduce yourself, your school, and then your question.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Jasmine Alexander. I'm from Florida A&M University, and I'm a second-year PhD student in environmental science. My question is for Dr. Wilson. What or whom has been your greatest obstacle in improving and eradicating environmental injustices?
Is the mic on?
No, can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me? The greatest obstacle? I would say the culture of academia. Because in you know, many cases in the academic institutions I've been at, from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to my postdoc in Michigan, to being at South Carolina, and now in Maryland, doing translational research and doing action research is not incentivized. It's not valued. And so my lens drives the work that I do. I grew up in a community near Alcorn. I'm from Vicksburg, for those of you who may be in from Alcorn. I'm 20 minutes from Alcorn. So near a highway, near a landfill, near a sewage treatment plant. So that's my context, that's my lens. That informs the work that I do. And that context and lens is seen as being biased, right? And so my lived experiences are not valued in academia. And so a lot of academic research, what's incentivized is only inquiry. But Boyer talks about 5 dimensions of science: the science of inquiry, the science of teaching, the science of integration, the science of engagement, the science of application. I do all 5, but only one is really valued. And so until we change the culture of academia, those of us who do applied work, those of us who do solution work, we won't be truly valued in the way that allows us to get tenure and promotion. So half of what I do wasn't counted in my tenure and promotion process because I'm working in the community. But guess what? Like I said, we shut down an incinerator. We got people access to sewer and water. We're using technology to provide solutions. So what we have to do is, as we fight for change in communities with science, we have to fight for change in academia too.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Okay.
Hi. Hello. My name is Joseph from UWM, and this question is for the last panelist. I was wondering, does the for the iothrone's function, does it depend on the concentration of waste that's put in it, or does it focus on any other factors that quantifies how much power is delivered?
So are you talking about the evaporation or the power?
It sounded like the power. Yeah, power.
The P-powered battery?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you know what a microbial fuel cell is. It's essentially, they're cultures of bacteria that essentially eat the waste that's in the battery, or in the electrolyte, the media. I guess it's a combination of things. I mean, I think it is, you know, sort of the concentration of what you put into the the urine that goes into the battery, but also it has to do with the surfaces on which the bacteria will then go and essentially deposit themselves in order to generate the electricity. Actually, I'm not the electrochemist on the team, so I can't answer a lot of questions on that. But yeah, it's essentially, I mean, that's sort of basically it's sort of how the system is built. And with most microbial fuel cells, they're always trained on what it is the media that you feed into it, and what the diversity of the bacteria in the fuel cell, in order for it to convert it efficiently into electricity, but also the surface chemistry.
Okay, we'll go to back, my left. Yes.
Yes, good morning. My name is Manu Platt. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at the Department of Georgia Tech and Emory University. This is one of the reasons that I love ERN, because they're able to bring panelists like this to kind of enlighten us in different ways that we don't get in our daily situation, so thank you. But I guess my question is for Dr. Youssef, but also for the others. It sounds like to me one of the major complications with all of these systems is capitalism. And I'm just curious, it seems like Dr. Youssef has been able to work with some entities that are about venture capital and promoting wealth, but I'm curious about how you all balance capitalism with these needs, and if there's a different way of thinking about these problems.
Yeah, it's not a perfect system for sure. I mean, we struggle as a non-app tech startup to try to get funding to build hardware, and not only hardware, but hardware for environmental purposes for poor communities. So we struggle to access those capital markets to get the resources we need. But I will say one thing. I think this country does a really good job. Not really. I would say we do a better job than most countries in the world of translating research into markets. So because we have processes and structures within intellectual property protection that allow the translation of university research into private entities that will commercialize it, that's one thing. There is an ecosystem for innovation that's more active than it is in other countries. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're purely profit driven, then it is, it doesn't jive completely with both certain types of innovation like hardware innovation or sustainability and environmental innovation. And it also, it doesn't jive with trying to do it for social impact, because oftentimes for social impact, you're trying to service populations that can't really pay a lot for what you're producing. So I don't know if I answered your questions, but there's pluses and minuses.
I'd also like to add a small dimension to this. So our foundation is structured a lot like the Gates Foundation might be, and there's a concept in our field of philanthrocapitalism, and what is the role of private family foundations in funding to scale a lot of this research. And from a family foundation, I have to say that I've been so impressed by the sheer magnitude of resources that can be brought to bear on an issue like modern slavery in such a fast way. So oftentimes when I'm asked, like, if I'll work for the US government or other entities, the first question I'll always say is, I'm a statistician, can you give me more data to work with? Can you give me a better and more complete data set? Or will most of my time be spent advising on grant applications for a fraction of the research funding that we need? And so I think there's a lot of debate about how this works. And if, for example, the fire fund that we're initiating, you could consider that perhaps that's a state or a government responsibility. But if innovation is truly needed, sometimes this is a really helpful way to try to get that capital dedicated to those research means really quickly. And so I've actually found that for all of the organizations that I've worked with, I really value this model, and I think that we can be much more effective at a faster scale if you can find an organization like that. And even Jacoby and I were mentioning maybe the Gates Foundation would scale something like that. So.
I want to just add one more thing too. So one thing when I said that I moved from the UN to venture capital, and in some ways it was like night and day, in other ways it was very much the same, because development organizations have to invest dollars today in outcomes that'll maybe show up 10 years from now with really unclear indirect metrics. So if you say You want to increase, educational retention for girls in schools, and you put a toilet in a school. You may or may not in 10 years see, prosperity for women in that village. I mean, it's hard to make a direct line. Venture capital, especially at the seed stage, kind of does the same thing, where they put dollars today in something coming out of a lab, and then have to figure out in 10 years from now whether that's going to become the next unicorn, the next billion-dollar exit. And so they have to make a lot of those same judgments of, how do I make a bet today that's going to lead to, a direct outcome in 10 years from now? How do I get credit for it? And how do I course correct in those 10 years if we're off on the wrong track and we fail? So I did see a lot of the fancy footwork that you see in not-for-profits and development organizations of trying to explain why they're not hitting their metrics, or why the metrics they're measuring are relevant to the outcomes in early stage venture capital. So in some ways, venture capitalists also don't do a hugely great job of turning their investments into, pure profit. So there's a lot of that. It's another thought that I had. I don't know if it was clear what I was trying to say, but there is kind of it's not a really well-functioning system.
So I see a lot of persons at the mic, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so 3 more questions. So what this means is we need to bring this type of panel back to ERN, and also that you will be available a little bit afterwards for those whose questions don't get asked. So yes, and if you have a presentation at 10 that you have to prepare for, quietly you can leave if you need to. Quietly, and we'll continue with the questions. So I'll go to the other mic, then to here, then to here. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Darren Butler. I'm a computer science student at Plenary College, and my question is open to any of the panelists. Some people may worry that working within the nonprofit or social impact sector won't pay well. What would you say to reassure someone who is passionate about social impact but concerned about finances?
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you for your question. I think we all have probably very encouraging things to say about people that are worried about social justice but how to make a living. My dad used to make a joke that I worked on human trafficking and that he expected to support me for the rest of my life because he expected that I would only work for nonprofits. I think you can see from all of our career paths that we've had to kind of change and evolve as we fit niches in our field, and every field has something like this. I would also say that especially in the nonprofit space, with which I'm very well acquainted from my work in human rights and human trafficking, I really want you to advocate for yourself. So I think there are definitely changing, and this is also from a labor exploitation perspective, I admit, I'm biased, but one of the things is that we kind of accept the behavior and the cultures. The prevailing culture and behavior is only what we accept, right? If we decide that we are not going to take that unpaid internship, or we are not going to do this, we are going to pursue any other way that we can to get to our goal, I think at some point, social justice does not mean that you sacrifice those rights for yourself, right? And it's a hard field. Generally speaking, there's a lot of burnout. It's a very high burden. You feel a moral calling to do your work. And so we end up working very, very hard out of our hearts and our passion. But you have to make sure that the rest of your life is also taken care of. So as young people, the one thing I want you to know is that you can advocate for yourself at any stage in this process. And if something doesn't seem sustainable to you, it probably isn't. And that means that it won't be a very productive or helpful work situation for you as well. Labor standards are changing, and I think that you guys are really going to benefit from that, especially if we can continue to agitate for you as well.
And I'll be real quick, and I'll answer in a different way. I think many of you have mentors, as I said earlier, that are important to you. I always advise my mentees that mentoring is essential. You have to find the right place for what you want to do and have the right kind of mentoring. I wouldn't be here on this stage today without Marjorie Campbell, without Rather Brown, without Dr. Evelyn Ellis and Dean Shuford at Alabama A&M, right? So that mentoring, you need that throughout your career. So regardless of the occupation, the organization, the space you're in, mentoring. It's lifelong, it's always needed, and that makes, you can have people that help you with your work-life balance. So I wanted to say that because just because you may finish your programs, you need to have mentoring throughout your careers. So that's an important point to emphasize.
Good morning. My name is Shayana Woodyard, and I'm a senior biology pre-med major from Hampton University. And my question is for Dr. Durgana. I wanted to know, how have you worked against a government's low willingness to fight the different problems presented in your work and possibly getting it into their policy?
Sure, yeah, a huge part of our work is focused on policy relevant research. And your question is so important because oftentimes the way we do research for impact is a bit different than sometimes how we might present it to an academic or another audience. And actually, I find it really interesting because I say that I am an academic that does this type of work, but I would have to say that it's a completely different area of training, right? When I'm building models, I'm not always looking for the coolest or the newest or the most complicated version, right? I'm gonna have to explain this to many different levels of government, and if I lose trust or if I lose interest, then that means that a critical policy change might be disregarded because someone along the way didn't understand what I was trying to say. So a lot of times I think it means that we find a way to communicate science and statistics in ways that are just as clear as they possibly can be. Right? We all know that there are so many ways to arrive at a solution or to come to the same ending. And for me, especially in the policy space, it's been so critical to actually focus mostly on building that credibility and being as transparent and as clear as possible. So in fact, we actually don't publish. Dr. Jacoby, he raises so many great issues about the academic system, but one of the things we have also is peer-reviewed publications, in that very many people in policy positions are not consulting peer-reviewed journals to make a lot of their decisions. And so that means that we actually give interviews or publish in different places and things that we know will reach the audiences that will actually care about that credibility. So it does require a bit of maneuvering, but once you start building that credibility, and from the beginning, like when we start a research program, we're already thinking about how we're going to present those findings, how we're going to use infographics, how we're going to explain this, how we're going to translate it into all the languages we need. So there's so many ways to do this. And to Dr. Wilson's point, I think all of us have mentored many students in the past, so if anyone's particularly interested in our areas of expertise, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but you can definitely reach out to us. And please, I make this appeal at every talk I give, and I think maybe 2 or 3 students, maybe out of a room this size, maybe more, I don't know. But they're the ones that follow up, and I make a point of setting aside at least 4 to 5 hours a week to just mentor whoever I can. So if you're interested in our fields, I encourage you to reach out to us. I'm sure we'll reply and we'll do what we can for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So she had some good tips for the poster givers there. Did you pick up on that? We have our last question, and then the others, if you can come to the front to interface with our panelists, that would be great. So our last question from here.
Hello, I'm Gabriella, and my question goes to Dr. Yusuf. Your research is really inspiring in a way where it helps solve basic necessities in most parts of the world, and it would be best if I could get the publications, if so. So that's the first thing, and the second thing is I'm currently a computer science major, and well, I would want to make an impact on the agricultural aspect, because I'm from Ethiopia, and most developing countries are agrarian countries, and the method that they use is not as modern or like technological as it's supposed to be. So in your way, you transferred from the academics into making a real impact. So how was that transition for you? Because there are certain expectations where parents would be like, okay, these are 2 different areas, like computer science and then trying to make an impact. And well, of course, technology actually matters, but how was that transition for you? Or like, how did you make
I bet if I asked my dad what I do, he has no clue. I mean, I didn't go to medical school, so he's like, what? I have no idea. So explaining it to your parents, gosh, maybe just don't. But no, I think, you know, actually, to be honest with you, right now, like, I think that the acceptance of the idea of doing something in STEM and translating it into a non-traditional pathway is so much more accepted, and established, and there's so many more examples of it right now. I happen to live in Cambridge, so like, you know, I felt like when I moved to Cambridge, I was an idiot for not having a CS degree, but you know, there's so many ways that you can apply what you're doing to these areas. And like, if you look at the World Bank and the UN, and you just go online, there are so many accelerators and hackathons and whatever to, you know, to bring together STEM students and especially in CS to come together around solutions around agriculture and digital ID and financial inclusion, and all, so it's really easy to find a lot of those. Just Google it, and you know, I think, you know, that's really, like, right now is a fantastic time to be doing this. It was really hard when I was doing it because people were like, "You're a sellout. Like, you just are a failed scientist," you know. But yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question, or?
Yes, and publications for your research, where could we find those?
Applications, you said?
No, your publications. If
We
you
don't publish because we're a company. Like, we're, you know, once we're ready, we're going to patent, but like, we don't publish. So yeah, is that what you're? Yeah, I mean, we're not like academia. I mean, we have to keep our stuff to ourselves in order to monetize it.
Okay. Thank
Sorry,
you.
was that too blunt?
So, thank you. I just want to note that if you're not presenting at 10, feel free to stay and ask your burning question if you have one of the panelists, as long as they're available. So let's give this panel another round of applause.
You guys were awesome. I'm so in
And our
awe.
moderator.
Oh my